Hi, I'm Isabel. Along with Jenny, we're current students in the UCLA graduate program for the conservation of cultural heritage, and we're going to be moderating today's panel. We're going to start off today with a land grant acknowledgement. We're acknowledging the area in Los Angeles where we're based, even though we're all kind of spread out. So we'll start off there and then move on to our conversation.
As Isabel said, for our land grant, we would like to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovong are, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hanukvatum, the ancestors, Ahihirom, the elders, and the Iohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging.
With that, we want to thank everyone for being here. We're really excited to welcome you all to this month's conservation conversation. On the last Friday of every month, we invite speakers to present on different topics relevant to the field of cultural heritage conservation. Today is slightly different from the other programs that we've had so far. It will be a little bit longer, it's 90 minutes. And with that time, we'll have time for short presentations by our guest speakers, followed by a moderated discussion that will be led by Jenny and I. And then we'll open to a general Q&A for everyone. So the moderated discussion will be about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll have time for about 30-40 minutes of general Q&A. So we hope we'll have time for everyone to get their questions in. And today we'll be focused on the fate of Confederate monuments.
So the question of how Americans should address public monuments to the Confederacy, problematic symbols of white supremacy, received significant re-examination in the summer of 2020. Which sparked fresh discourse on how these monuments contribute to our understanding of history, cultural values, and identity, and what actions can and should be taken as a response. So today we'll be exploring how professionals in the field of architecture, conservation, and history are currently addressing these topics and their visions for the fate of these works. The ambition of this panel isn't just to explore the opinions of professionals on this matter, but also to understand how this discourse has evolved and already perhaps impacted these fields today. So with that, we'll give a quick intro to each of our panelists, and then we'll let them start with their presentations.
So Burt Pinnock, you can raise your hand. Burt is a principal and chairman of the board at Baskerville, a 123-year-old design firm. For Burt, architecture and design isn't just a job, it's his personal contribution to the well-being and vitality of our communities. Over his 30-year career, Burt's commitment and passion has created impactful work for neighborhoods, cultural institutions, and forward-thinking companies, including the Black History Museum and the Cultural Center of Virginia, Civil Rights Memorial Plaza at the Virginia Capitol, the Colebrook Affordable Housing Master Plan, and many more. A founder and board member of the nonprofit Storefront for Community Design, Burt currently serves as chairman of the Commonwealth of Virginia's Art and Architectural Review Board and is a board member of the Legal Aid Justice Center, amongst many other board and committee engagements. Burt is a graduate of Virginia Tech and calls Richmond, Virginia home.
Our next presenter is Katherine Ridgway. Katherine has been the State Archaeological Conservator for the Virginia Department of Historical Resources, or DHR, for 8 years. In this position, she has recently provided advice on the conservation and preservation considerations involved when communities and agencies in the Commonwealth are working with Confederate and other contested monuments. She helped to write the DHR guidance regarding Confederate monuments document and participated in the AIC Contested Monument Working Group. Katherine is a William & Mary graduate and received her master's degree from Durham University in Northern England in the conservation of historic objects. She has over 20 years of conservation experience, including working as an assistant conservator at the Field Museum in Chicago and as the Fine and Decorative Arts Conservator for George Washington's Mount Vernon. She's also a fellow in the AIC and the president of the Virginia Conservation Association.
And last but not least, we have Dell Upton, who's an architectural historian. He's also a distinguished research professor in the art history department at UCLA, where he's taught for 12 years before retiring in 2020. He previously taught at Berkeley and the University of Virginia. Dell is the author of What Can and Can't Be Said About Race, Uplift in Monument Building in the Contemporary South, which was published by Yale in 2015, as well as numerous articles about contemporary monument debates in the United States and Italy. Among his other books are American Architecture, A Thematic History, published by Oxford in 2019, and Another City, Urban Life and Urban Spaces in the New American Republic, published by Yale in 2008. During the current academic year, he is serving as the Kress-Benecke Professor at the Center for Advanced Studies of the Visual Arts, National Gallery Art in DC. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Dell, who's going to start us off with the presentation.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be back at UCLA in some odd form. I want to make three brief observations to open this. And the first is has to do with the fact with the status of Confederate monuments as white supremacist monuments. And I want to say that by now this is a truism. Everybody knows it. Even those who defend retaining the statues, despite this, know it. Even those who deny that they're white supremacist monuments really know it. So it doesn't help, I think, in this kind of debate simply to keep repeating that over and over, that we need to put Confederate monuments into a broader historical context. So one point I think that's important to make as we discuss what to do with these is that historically monuments have had short lives. They've been altered, moved, repurposed, destroyed over and over and over again. And that's important because a common complaint about removing statues is that to do so is to erase history. History conceived of as some fixed and immutable entity, and monuments is part of it. But it seems to me that an important way, an interesting way, a more accurate way to think about monuments is less that they are history or analogies to history books than they're press releases or sound bites. They're statements made for a moment. And those statements then are liable to destruction or alteration when they're outdated. The destruction of King George III statue in New York during the Revolution, the Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, when inscriptions of people who are no longer welcome are erased. And this is true not only of leaders like kings and emperors, but it was also true in the past of statues dedicated to influential private people, the heirs of people to whom honorific statues were dedicated, were constantly challenged to find ways to keep their monuments from being destroyed or moved to less favorable places. So the point is that alteration, removal, destruction in the history of monuments is the norm rather than the exception. And my third point is that, and since this conversation is taking place under the auspices of a conservation program, raises the issue of what we should do physically with these monuments. Certainly most of them can and should be removed. But an argument, I think, can be made for keeping some of them, not under the rubric of contextualization, which is a kind of weasel word, I think, but that they can be relaunched into the stream of history. And here, one example that I'm thinking about is the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, which attracted so much attention this summer. This statue is a tribute to a hero of white supremacy, but also, and it's as I'll mention in a moment, why this is an important point, it was also the centerpiece of a real estate development, Monument Avenue, that was meant to attract elite white purchasers. And as most of you probably know, in the post-George Floyd murder demonstrations, it became a gathering place. It became a canvas for public art, both spray painted and projected, as you see in the photo on the left. So if we look at the Lee Monument in its current state, it seems to me that it can be said not to be history in the sense that it is usually, that word is usually used in these debates, but as evidence of a transition from one worldview and its aesthetic expression to another worldview. So my argument would be that it should stay in place, that it should be left in its current condition, and that it should be left open to continual alteration. And the reason I pointed out that it's the center of a real estate scheme is that one objection to my proposal is that it will be likely argued that this is unsightly, that the graffitied and altered statue is something that is offensive to people. That argument, it seems to me, is simply a way of translating the race and class dynamic that created the monument into the terms of aesthetic values, but essentially with essentially the same players on each side. And that, it seems to me, introduces a kind of continuing tension that I find appealing. And so I'll leave it there.
Hello, everyone. I'm Katherine Ridgway. I'm the State Archaeological Conservator for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. As a state government employee, I've been helping communities around the Commonwealth work towards decisions about their contested monuments and working with them to find the safest ways for people and monuments to be kept in place or removed to another location. I've also been involved in planning of removal of Lee Monument on Monument Avenue, if that is to take place. Over time, it's not so much that the meaning of the monuments has changed, but that the public tolerance and agreement with that meaning has changed. Now we as preservationists are also facing a change in our perspective on vandalism and graffiti, and what this means as far as the history of the monuments, and how that graffiti changes the nature of the monuments. It can make preservationists and conservators uncomfortable to make decisions about what is historic when the history is still being written. The Department of Historic Resources created a guidance document to help get the word out about the preservation of contested monuments, either in situ or at another location, and the resources that we could provide. This document includes legal issues, preservation issues, and how to access resources. In this document, we state that graffiti, in the case of the current civil unrest, is considered historic and should be documented and kept whenever possible. Any damage that does not constitute a public safety hazard should also be kept. What we're trying to avoid is situations that might cause risk to human safety and to the safety of monuments. We're trying to head off at the pass, moving monuments in the middle of the night without a proper plan. You can see here a picture of an empty pedestal where a monument was moved in the middle of the night. It was a helicopter came, took the monument, and flew off with it. It was the owner of the monument who moved the monument, but you can see that in the wake of this kind of removal, there's, besides the fact that they've caused a lot of damage, it's a safety issue to have walkways that are damaged. And so our hope is that we can prevent the removal or moving of these monuments without a solid plan that's safe for both the monuments and the people who are involved. As for Lee specifically, I thought it might help with an understanding of these monuments just to get a sense of exactly how monumental monuments are. The cornerstone was placed in 1887. The monument was put on the pedestal in 1890. The artist, and I am for sure going to say this name wrong, Marius Jean-Antonin Mercier. The statue was created at the foundry of Thubeau Brothers in Paris, France. The monument measures 61 feet from the bottom of the pedestal to the top of Lee. The granite plinth is 40 feet tall. Lee on his horse is 21 feet tall. The statue weighs 13 tons. On June 4th, 2020, Governor Northam ordered the removal of Lee, which is the only monument on Monument Avenue specifically under the purview of the state government. The rest of the monuments are controlled by the city of Richmond. The Department of General Services hired a conservation company to perform the removal. I was asked to review the removal proposal and help with the preservation of the time capsule. But then legal roadblocks brought the process to a halt. Currently, the Virginia State Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case for the statue to remain in place. If you'd like to learn more about Monument Avenue, I highly recommend the American Civil War Museum's on Monument Avenue website. It is definitely worth checking out and has a lot of great information. And thank you for coming and joining us for this conversation.
Again, thanks for having me. I'm going to try and be brief. I'm going to come at this from a little bit of a different perspective, but you're going to see some of the same imagery. The Southern Poverty Law Center's Whose Heritage project is worth viewing and visiting if you haven't. So back in 2015, when this debate got heated up as a result of a shooting in South Carolina, because the perpetrator sort of espoused some of this Confederate paraphernalia as reasoning behind some of his actions. We as a country couldn't deal with the gun issue, so we took up a different one, and here we are today. But this illustrates at the time over 1,700 monuments and memorials to the Confederacy, and then it's worth noting that when these were installed, I mean, again, sort of this idea, and thank you, Dell, for saying it, that this is a truism that we're dealing with here, so that's not a debate anymore. Questions always come up, whose truth? And I think we just need to get past that. But as designers, we think about, okay, how are we adding context to this? That's the catchphrase we work with, right? So it's, whose story are we telling? How are we telling a complete story? And who's in control of it? So a couple of projects that we're working on right now, right? Trying to lift up sort of the other narratives around slavery, the Confederacy, white supremacy. We have some of our venerable national institutions that are reckoning with their history and roles in slavery. And the ideas that this one project exhibits are wanting to make sure that, one, it's not completely figurative, right? I mean, the conversation of the form, literally, what is the artistic interpretation of these memorials is something that is certainly worth debating. But I think our position is these things that represent others who were not indigenous to this country means that should the aesthetic be indigenous to this country, right? This is on the campus of William and Mary, and I remember we had a debate of should it be more classical in its form, and I had to laugh a little bit. The idea of a classical monument to the enslaved, and I can't hear everybody out there, but I hope you're at least appreciating the irony of it. This is two proposals for the memorial to the Emancipation Proclamation here in Richmond. One very figuratively and one very symbolic in its form. And I like it because Dell said in another panel we did together, he was quoting about make no graven images. And it caused me to question, is what we're doing here the right thing? It's Nat Turner represented in bronze, I think 2.5 times life size. It's a question. How do we move forward in this conversation? So as noted, I live at the epicenter of some of this conversation. From the 1886 Sanborn map of Richmond, Virginia, through years of research, these red dots kind of illustrate locations of slave trade and the selling of slaves in Richmond. And this is obviously ongoing research. And it's not that these are locations that are identified with a Lex plaque that says, here's what happened here. But the idea that we are beginning to fill in the story, particularly in Richmond, of what all of this has meant is where we are. Lumpkin's Jail is a well-known excavation in Richmond, Virginia. It's part of the story of slavery and is critical to then the development around that site for a national slavery museum that recognizes this as a site of conscience, recognizes the role. So when we talk about adding context to this narrative, I think these are the kinds of things that we're doing currently, right? But then there is, I think this is almost a perfect example of what I think the power of adding context without destroying. Charging Bull, placed in late 80s, 1989, I think, sort of representing the power of the economy and all that Wall Street stood for. Fearless Girl, this is not the original location of this piece of work, but when put in this place, significantly changed the dynamic and the meaning of the existing sculpture, of existing Charging Bull, without touching it. I thought that was a pretty amazing thing. That's a dialogue, that's a conversation that we have been having in Richmond and will continue to have. So yes, we've all three of your panelists here have brought this up. Where I want to go with this is what is kind of happening in the space on the ground right now. And Katherine, thank you for bringing it up. Yes, as chair of the state's Art and Architecture Review Board, we approved, I think it was last fall, the removal of the Lee Monument, and we'll see how it plays out. But the idea that a public space like this has been wholly curated and narrated and up until recently operated by a community is very powerful. And so how do you capture that as a process? How do you capture it as a means to get to an end of this dialogue? I'm not sure, but certainly the VMFA, Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War, starts to add more to that context. So removal, is it warranted? I don't know, but we can have that conversation now. So I think that's, let me see, did I have more? Oh yeah, because I always like what Maya Angelou says, just do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So let's just all do better.
Thank you, Burt. That was actually a fantastic point to end the presentations on and jump into our discussion. Thank you, all three of you, for kind of setting the stage of this conversation. I think that was a great kind of overview of the history of monuments and kind of some of the current discourse that's going on. So we'd like to start off with just a question about the discourse itself. So this debate about the ethics of placing and maintaining Confederate monuments and you know, even other contested monuments, it's not new. There's been debates ever since the end of the Civil War. So the question is, how is this debate and dialogue different today than it was over the last century and a half? And also, since the three of you have all been very active in these current conversations, how have you seen it change even in this last, you know, half a year that we've been discussing and debating the topic?
Well, I'll just say, I think it would be naive not to cite the events of January 6th as, wow, as evidence of where we are. And so how after 2015, my hope was that this was going to sort of bring us more together. I don't know that that's what's happening. So the debate is continuing to heat up.
Absolutely.
I feel like I noticed a change when Charlottesville happened and people were having more conversations in general. And then 2020, it became more about action. And I think that has been a bigger change, is that there's been more action than just dialogue. There's been both. So in a way, I don't think there has been as much before.
Absolutely.
Say that with Katherine, I agree that things changed in 2017 in the sense that people that I know who were against removing monuments, who thought they should be contextualized or reinterpreted in some way after Charlottesville, and some of them lived in Charlottesville, no longer held that point of view. A couple of years ago, I wrote a little piece of which I suggested that eventually people would just start taking monuments down.
Mm-hmm.
I never imagined it would happen that soon. So I was kind of shocked by that. And Burt mentioned January 6th, and it's true that that kind of action can go in the other way as well. And I still think that what was done this summer was right, but it puts it into a much more complex kind of political setting to think about what happens when insurgency goes in the other direction.
Yes, absolutely.
And I was just going to say, Dell, I don't know if it's the right parallel to draw, but Madge Bemis, who you know, and she says hi, we sit around her dining room table every Monday night and discuss, are we at the precipice of another civil war? And I think if you draw the parallels historically, like, okay, it kind of feels like that, and almost over the same issue. So we got a lot of growing up to do still.
Yes.
It's definitely clear that while the discourse has changed, there's still so much to do, still so much to explore and actions to take, as you guys have all mentioned.
Yeah, I was really, I think, struck this year that so many of the conversations moved away from recontextualization to removing them, and a lot of groups that had been more open to alternatives, like the National Trust or the SAH, all came out with these strong statements saying that removal is, a really important step. And so I kind of wanted to hear from you, all of you. What do you think has gone into that change? And I know Katherine has also been with AIC working on their contested monuments committee, and so what that process looked like within the conservation community and how that conversation changed.
I mean, to start with recontextualization, I think that to some extent people started to realize that effective recontextualization is extremely difficult when you're dealing with something that's 40 feet tall, one little sign, or makes very little difference. Having worked in a museum, you see all the time nobody read the sign for the exhibit, but they wanted to look at the artifacts for the exhibit. And so I think that it became clear as there were discussions about recontextualization that the effectiveness of that, I don't think was going to be what people had hoped. I don't, that's what I sort of saw. That you have to change the landscape to change the context in a way.
And I think, you know, everybody was surprised when the actions around Marcus David Peters Circle took place. All of a sudden, the idea of what contextualization might be changed.
Right.
But I would still go back to 2015, and with Dylan Roof, and I'm sorry for saying his name, waving a Confederate flag, showed how these artifacts, this paraphernalia, is being weaponized. It's continually being weaponized, and to a greater degree. And that's what I meant when sort of, when you watch sort of the images from January 6th, this is the weaponization of these types of artifacts.
Yeah. It takes a huge thing to recontextualize a huge thing. So.
Well, one thing that I think is really important to understand is that because of our training and looking at things that are called works of art, we tend to forget that monuments are not individual things. They are part of a landscape, as Katherine said, and that whole landscape tells a story that individual monuments are only a part of. So if we take down Lee or leave him up, there is still plenty of other kinds of stories, plenty of other parts of that story that are still there. It's a narrative of what, in our case, what America is about, what aspects of it should be proud of. And I think that some of the things you saw this summer, like the destruction of the Columbus Monument in Richmond and other places, represents a kind of inarticulate expression of that realization. It's not the one guy on his horse, it's the entire story that we've been taught that needs to be rethought in a radical way.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually brings up an interesting question too, because we talk a lot about monuments, but I think in previous conversations with both Katherine and Burt, you've brought up kind of non-standard monuments, things that aren't just statues. So there are certain monuments that are actually also grave markers, or as Burt has mentioned, Stone Mountain, something of that monumental size that would require kind of extreme destruction to remove, and how those might complicate these questions of removal and complicate the context in which you're working in. So I was wondering if any of you wanted to comment on those.
Would you like to start, Burt, or?
You go.
In Richmond, one of the best examples is the monument to A.P. Hill, General A.P. Hill. He and his wife are buried under that monument, which is in the middle of it's a traffic circle intersection in Richmond. And there are previously in Virginia, there was legislation that protected the monuments, and that has been since changed, but there's still protections in place that protect burial grounds for good reason. And so it is another step that needs to be taken, because there has to be a certain amount of respect for people who've passed away. And so while it doesn't mean that that monument isn't going to move, I think this is a monument that is an area that's controlled by the city of Richmond. It just means that there has to be a different process for that, where there are burial permits, or working with funeral homes, or working with others who are professionals at removing human remains. And then the monuments can be addressed. But it doesn't mean that it's an obstacle that can't be overcome. It just means it might take longer than normal.
And I think that's a great example, Karen, because I'll put it in the context. First, we work with the development community on projects all the time, and you're doing a greenfield development and you discover, oops, there's a small burial ground here, a small private plot or something. So remains are exhumed and reinterred in some proper way, kind of thing. So the fact that this is was part of a sort of Confederate memorial and protected by state legislation has been removed, I don't think there's any reason we can't think in the same way. But there's a distinction here to make in the question of, what do we think about those icons that are in burial grounds or whatnot. I want to make the distinction between what is the public realm and what is private space, private property, right? And I think that's part of it. So,
right, yeah.
As a society, totally, in our public spaces, what is it that we allow to be valued or represented or raised as iconography?
Right. AP's a different kind of case because he's not in a burial ground. He's in a public throughway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Burt's point is really important, and it applies particularly to something like Stone Mountain, which is privately owned. It's a privately run park, and it is what we're really talking about is whether the public should be supporting things such as Confederate monuments, monuments that exalt one portion of the population over another. As far as Hill being buried under his monument, the same was true of Nathan Bedford Forrest in Memphis. Forrest and his wife were buried under the monument, and the city simply moved him to a cemetery. And then for various legal reasons about having to do with public ownership and so on, they formally gave control of the park he was in to the University of Memphis, and the University of Memphis took it down. So, the question of the question of the public and what the public should support, whether that changes over time, I think is really central to this discussion, and it often doesn't get brought up.
All of you touched on, kind of touched on this, but I just wanted to kind of go a little bit more in depth, that when we talk about removing statues from public spaces, there's a lot more that goes into it than just what we perceive to be right. So I wanted to kind of just ask some of the practical questions of, what are some of the legal considerations, the financial planning considerations, who's on decision-making committees, how are decisions made? So just kind of walk through some of that process. I know this can also differ, statue to statue, monument to monument.
Well, I'll start, sure.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Burt.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think in the Monument Avenue situation that Katherine spoke about, where Lee is a state-owned piece of property and the others are city-owned, it was, I think, the administration of the city sort of made a unilateral decision to remove them. It wasn't without protest and controversy, and not without legal challenge, but I think it has stood thus far that yes, the city has right to maintain its public property in the best interest of the citizenry. So kind of under that guise, that's how it was done. But I will say it's certainly worth public debate. But going back to something Dell said way at the top of this, we all have to agree what the truisms are around this debate. We're not quite there yet. So,
and as far as when people call me in Virginia, sometimes the question is that property is owned by one person or someone or group, usually the United Daughters of the Confederacy, paid to have the monument put in place. And so there are questions about whether or not counties feel like they have the right to remove things that were paid for by other people, and there's questions of ownerships there. And and for the most part, those um, have been sorted out. But the other issue, the other question that comes up frequently is, what do we do with it once we moved it? And so that's where also a lot of the community conversation has to happen. Um, and the people who are in the local area need to have that conversation, and how those local areas organize that is really dependent on, I think, that the local governments, if I'm correct. I think that Richmond has confronted things differently than Fairfax County or some other county has. And so having a conversation, though, and a public conversation, is incredibly important about what to do with the monuments from beginning to end, having an entire plan.
And I want to sort of cite a specific example around that with Monument Avenue. So what is happening is, one, the governor and the administration of Virginia have committed dollars, to be sort of administered through the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts on the reimagining of Monument Avenue, right? As to how that landscape will change. But at the same time, there are grassroots groups that are sort of forming amongst themselves on trying to discuss how to reimagine Monument Avenue. But the positive is that they're trying to engage every voice, including members of the Black Lives Matter, those who were in dissent and protest around the site, those who live on Monument Avenue, and even those who may support what these statues represent. And I think that's a positive step. And I think collectively, these 50 or so people, that's the size of it today, realize that this is a difficult path forward, but it certainly is worthwhile to try and approach it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of piggyback off what you were just saying, Burt, that when you're working with groups of people that recognize that these statues were intentionally put out for white supremacist reasons, and then you also have groups of people who are buying into a false narrative that this is heritage or history. And I think, as Dell really rightly put out, that that's not what we're here to discuss today. That's I think there's a lot of great writing that I welcome attendees to go forth and research. But that this is still a pretty widely held belief in our public. And how do you work with members of the public that have these incredibly conflicting viewpoints? And how do you bring them to the table to have discussions and create community and public plans?
Isabel, when you figure it out, will you let me know?
I agree. It's hard. Yeah. I think education is a lot of it, is trying to get as much information out as in as many platforms and formats as possible.
And so to be serious, and thank you, Katherine. So in some of the work we do, the goal is to, like I showed sort of the data from the Southern Poverty Law Center, it's like bring the facts to the table, because, and I'm going to keep going to us, we have to agree what is true. So take the bias consciousness out of it, take the what you believe out of it, to then have a forward conversation of what is it we're trying to do here. So I think if we can get constituencies to agree that our goal here is to fill in the blank, and then say, does what we have here represent what we've all stated as a goal? Because what I find is, if you can sort of remove that imagery from the conversation to start, most people will land in a common place as to what the intent of anything is, whether it's what you want to represent in the public space of Monument Avenue, what you want to represent on the historic campus of William and Mary, or how you want to, any number of things. So it's a little bit of a pull it apart, and now let's put it back together.
Thank you. Sorry, Catherine, did you want to add something?
No.
Okay.
Good.
So just looking at time, we do have quite a few questions that are coming in. So just to try and wrap up some of this discussion, we want to ask one more question and then we can move into the Q&A. I guess for now, we wanted to ask any suggestions because we are talking about community and, we've kind of created our own community with this panel talking about how we can get involved as listeners, as individuals, as professionals, and be a part of this decision-making process.
Vote. Vote is an easy one. Educate yourself by coming to webinars and trying to find information. And then, volunteer to be a part of things. There are plenty of organizations out there doing great work. So, that's what I would recommend.
Agreed. I mean, it's be as informed as possible about any number of the bullet points of the issue. What is your local legislation? What is, who's active in trying to make this happen or not? Figure out where you stand and plug in. Our challenge is always trying to reach everybody who's interested. And so those who are interested, reach back out to us. We welcome it.
Thank you. Thank you all three for participating in our discussion. I know there's a lot more questions that we had that we haven't quite gotten to, but I'm sure some of the questions from our audience will probably cover some of those. So, go ahead, Isabel.
I was just going to say, I know Jenny and I have a lot more we were going to bring up too, but I think absolutely we should move to the general Q&A. So I'm just going to start in the order of what we've gotten. So the first question comes from Marilyn, who asks, why isn't it a safety issue to people of color by making it okay to honor someone who put people of color in danger by the life and actions of the person being honored in the monument?
I don't disagree that I think that is probably a safety issue. I think there's a lot of safety issues involved with all of these monuments. The ones I'm dealing with are mostly sort of practical. How do we move this in a safe way, sort of? But I think there's a lot of different ways, and having people. I think one of the concerns is having people hurt themselves by pulling down monuments, which has happened already in Virginia, and trying to help people do things like removing monuments in a way that's safe for everybody. But I think there's lots of ways these monuments can be safety issues.
Unless, sorry, unless Dell or Burt want to add on to that, I think that segues really nicely into the next question. So the next question comes from David, who asks, we see in both historic and recent images of monument removal, the crowds, the spectacle, the catharsis, and it seems that the act of removal, the ritual, the crowd is significant in addition to the fate of the monuments themselves. How do you feel about the act of removal in this discussion? Who should be present? Is it part of the conversation about what to do with the monument? And I'll tack a little bit on to ask about some of the safety issues that I know as conservators and people responsible for public spaces. How do you feel about that?
Do we want to start with the catharsis part and then get to the practical?
Sure. I think at this stage, yes, there certainly is a cathartic nature to the removal of these. And if that, again, going back to the idea of the community being engaged about how this is done and what is done, I think that should be an open invitation, if you will, as opposed to sort of Catherine was saying, the things being done under cover of night. Because the idea is that this is reflective of, again, what we as a society, as a community think and feel. I would like to get to the point where it doesn't require that, and it's just sort of, we've decided that the remnants of the lost cause no longer represented who we are, so can we just remove them and be done? But there's value there. I would just sort of, not to sort of contradict myself, but the idea of the of the concentration camps, right? There at one point it was we should remove them all, but then that changed to no, we in order to remember and make sure this never happens again, this history should be preserved in some way. So that there's validity to that position. We just haven't grown enough or distant enough from this narrative to be there.
And from a safety point of view, Stonewall Jackson on Monument Avenue is just a few blocks from here, and we heard he was coming down because in the age of social media, there's no way to keep something a secret like that. Not the moving of a monument, and it was amazing. Everybody in the local area was there, and it was just it was an amazing feeling. But there were safety concerns, I think, for the folks moving it. One of which was that many drones showed up out of nowhere, and two problems with that being that the drones were flying sometimes very close to the men trying to do the work, and working with saws and different things to try and remove these monuments from the pedestals, which is, I'm sure, not something that they were excited to see. And second of all, having worked now with some of the monuments and some of the other things that have gone on in Richmond, we don't know who operates those drones, and we don't know why they're taking pictures of things. And I personally have come out of buildings where I've been helping with damage and had been photographed by people. And so there are safety concerns as far as making sure that the people who are doing this work are able to do it safely for a lot of different reasons. And so on the one hand, I like the idea of big fences to keep people away, to help make sure that this process is safe for the people doing it and for the people watching. But on the other hand, I was really close when they were moving Stonewall Jackson, and it was amazing. So I think that now I also got a lot of texts when the fence went up around Lee, because people know that I'm involved with that, and they're like, is he moving today? Why is there a fence going up? And I think people don't understand that Lee has to come down in pieces, that it's a complicated process, and it just really is safer for everybody if there's a certain distance there. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid and helpful view from someone who's actually had the experience of working and the presence of or experience of what that situation actually entails. If we can jump on to another question, this is actually kind of recobbled from a few questions, because we had a couple of attendees who asked very similar questions. So from both Hannah Staluk and Alex Lim, they had a question about using this kind of community space to recontextualize as an option instead of removing a Confederate statue. So either creating a separate piece that could work in tandem, or by moving an object or a statue somewhere that it could have a different context, to create a different message instead of simple recontextualization with a label or something like that. And also just discussing a little bit of what decontextualization of a statue would actually entail or what it would mean.
One of the good examples that I've heard recently is the city of Richmond is deciding who is going to receive the various monuments that have already been removed, and the Valentine's proposal, I think, is an excellent example of how you can move these monuments and recontextualize them. They're offering to take Jefferson Davis, and because they own the building, the Valentine Museum owns the building where the studio of the artist who created that original monument, they'd like to take that statue and put it back in that studio in the same orientation as when he was pulled down from the position that he was in, and leaving the graffiti and showing that this is a studio where the statue was created, this was the history of that creation, and then bringing it full circle to say now this is the final resting place of this statue and this is how it came to be removed. And I think that's a really interesting way to remove a monument and then tell the entire history of it and recontextualize it in a way that doesn't keep it out on its tall tower out in Monument Avenue. I'm sure Burt has examples as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a fantastic national competition done and put on that involved the Valentine and
right, yeah.
Virginia Commonwealth University, Storefront for Community Design, another nonprofit, in sort of general devotion, general demotion is the name of it, and it was opened to people to reimagine, you know, how you look at Monument Avenue, how you contextualize Monument Avenue. There were some fantastic ideas. There were, for example, sort of removing the bronzes from the pedestals and bringing them to a more human scale and then putting them in context was an idea, right? Or sort of bringing these things down from their 40-foot, 5-story tall sort of ideas into sort of the human realm. So the idea of bringing things into the human realm was prevalent there. Obviously, removing them and reimagining them was also as well. But I think I would also just sort of put this in the context of a question. I know I keep doing that, so hopefully the audience doesn't get mad. It's like, why does he keep asking questions? You know, if you think of it as, okay, I want to create a space that is a response to Jim Crow and all of this, would I do it in this space? As Dell pointed out, you know, Monument Avenue, the Lee Circle came about through sort of a real estate venture. If I were going to helicopter up and say, I want to create something, a public space about this narrative, would I do it right here? I probably wouldn't. So maybe it is just sort of the context is completely removed from the site of the original saying, right? So I don't know, it's a question.
I guess my response is kind of mixed, in line with what I was saying earlier about the temporality of temporariness of monuments. I think the values for which these monuments stand, and we should not think just of these big, enormous monuments like Monument Avenue, but the thousands of little standing soldiers in front of every courthouse in the South. The values are gone, and the default should be that those statues should go, unless there's a reason, some better use that to which they can be put. And if I could, let me just show you one image, show you what I mean. That. Cahinda Wiley's statue, which is a response to the Jeb Stuart statue on as you can see from the pose and so on Monument Avenue. Without Jeb Stuart, you don't quite get the point. I could imagine moving Stewart to the grounds of the Virginia Museum where Wiley's statue is, putting him on the ground and having Wiley's statue looking back toward him. That would be a way in which you could give that statue, give the Confederate statue a different meaning, robbed it of its original meaning, and also reinforce the meanings of the Wiley monument. So in other words, to keep it, you don't contextualize it just because you want to keep it. You make it do some other work.
I want to just kind of add, we had a few questions in the chat about how graffiti is used as a recontextualization and some of the conservation issues with that and the debates around keeping, destroying that, and how that changes our perception of that, and whether we consolidate and keep that these reinterpretations of it, of these spaces.
Here's the question. It's not like the graffiti is stopping. So when do you decide the graffiti is done?
You don't.
Right. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure there's an answer to that. I'm going to steal Burt's. I'm going to ask a question. When do you decide the graffiti is done?
I think it will decide for itself when that's no longer an issue. When that statue is no longer an issue, then people won't be interested in graffitiing it again. I think one of the values of it is, there was a question earlier about the ethics of putting up these monuments in the first place. They're put up by a small group of people, not only without any input from the Black community, but without any input from most whites. There were people who had the money and the political strings to put it up. And then they've been protected from any kind of response. So I see the great graffiti as a kind of belated public comment hearing on the monument.
Can I, sorry, I'm just going to insert myself, even though I'm not technically part of this panel. I have a question, which is, if graffiti as the same kind of active exuberant expression, Dell, if graffiti was applied to the Kehinde Wiley, would we accept that graffiti? And I guess I have my question is, I actually posed this question as being a museum conservator for many years, who was actively removing graffiti from non-Confederate monuments or sculptures outside of on the grounds of the museum, because we didn't want to encourage additional graffiti. But so my question is, again, like, what do we think about graffiti, extending beyond these Confederate monuments? Has it changed the way we think about graffiti, i.e., back to my Kehinde Wiley question, would we be accepting of graffiti on that monument? Thank you.
I guess my response would be that it's a kind of false equivalence. That is, that we can't really make one rule for it all. There's a reason that a reason I think that we applaud in general that Robert E. Lee attracts graffiti. The reasons that Kehinde Wiley might attract graffiti, and this has happened. I mean, the Frederick Douglass statue in Rochester was damaged, and so on. I mean, it's part of public discourse. We have to decide what things we value and what things we don't, and protect what we value, and the hell with what we don't.
And I think that I'm not exactly sure who was involved, but the Arthur Ashe statue, which is further down Monument Avenue, was vandalized a little. And I think actually some of the public, people who live in that space and others, took it upon themselves to clean it, which was a very interesting kind of dynamic. So some small portion of the public spoke and some other portion of the public responded.
It's also interesting because my understanding is that it's possible the people who did that graffiti to Arthur Ashe were not actually from the state of Virginia, which is another conversation that is it who gets to have that opinion? And I know that shortly after the graffiti started on Lee, there was graffiti at 2 African American cemeteries and a Jewish cemetery and another public property, and it was white supremacist graffiti that was immediately as possible removed. And again, it's the false equivalency. Those they're not the same, and certainly not when you're talking about a cemetery.
And that's been going on long before the
Yeah.
monuments. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I think we're going to move now to, we've had a few people with their hands up for a while. So we're going to hand the floor to Richard Ackroyd. Richard, I think you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I'm sorry, I don't have a question. I was just inadvertently hit a button, so my apologies.
That's okay. We've all done that. In that case, I'm going to move to a question from Carly, who asks, I'm going to shorten it just a smidge and rephrase a little. I hope she'll forgive me. How does the conversation about Confederate monuments compare and contrast with other discussions, both at a national and international level, on other contested monuments?
Oh man, I've held the opinion that we as a country are just not old enough to have sort of the right and complete informed opinion about some of these things, right? Sort of, you know, we're not a Greek society or a Roman society in that respect. But you know, when Saddam Hussein came down, it was just because, like the King George example that Dell used, it was, okay, this is temporal ephemera, time for it to go. I don't think that attitude is radically different across the globe, but that's just me.
I think for me, the difference between having a conversation about Confederate monuments and other contested monuments is that I personally feel, both because I'm a state employee and a white woman, that I need to slow down my thinking and think much more carefully about how I speak about things. For people who know me, they know I'm very opinionated and I'm extremely happy to give my opinions. But I feel like I've had to be extra thoughtful in having conversations. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
But with respect to the question about other places, one of the things that I think is distinctive about the Confederate monument discussion is that the values that Confederate monuments represent are still in play. Now, it's different to talk about what should be done to a monument to a Roman emperor, as opposed to one to people who are still revered by a small portion of the population. The second is that certainly in Europe, after George Floyd and the initial demonstrations, protest demonstrations over the murder of George Floyd, in many parts of Europe particularly, and North America, people began asking themselves the same kinds of questions. So the Edward Colson going into the river in Bristol, and Macdonald, the founding premier of Canada, is suddenly a problem in Canada. But it's also long been true that decolonization has brought the destruction of monuments. I was reading the other day a quotation, a statement about when India got its independence from Britain, and the Indians proposed to send back all the statues of British figures, and the British ambassador said something like, "Who would want what would we do with all that old junk, much of which is not very interesting?" Australia has a statue of Queen Victoria that they basically took off the junk pile in Ireland when Ireland became free. So reckoning, it's part of that constant re-reckoning with monuments. The difference is that in the South in the United States, the monuments we're talking about to some extent are still living.
Thank you. I know it's a lot. It's a huge discussion to take on for 5 minutes. Kelly Cobble has had a number of questions. We're going to turn the microphone over to her. Kelly, are you there? Kelly, if you have your mic on, you can ask your question. I'm gonna just move to another question while we figure out what's going on with the Kelly's tech here. Let's see. I'll ask one of Kelly's questions that she's put in our Q&A, who asks, as an objects conservator who's worked on monuments on federal or state property, she kind of asks, let's see, trying to word this.
Sorry, that's actually me.
Right, hi there. I'll let you word this and you butcher it then.
Kelly is my boss and she wasn't able to join, so she sent me instead. My name's actually Natanya Schiff. So that's why I didn't realize.
Oh,
no, it's okay. So I did kind of have two questions. The shorter one was essentially that I'm an objects conservator and I've worked on a lot of federal and state properties caring for monuments, and you know, some of that work is funded by taxpayer dollars, and I was wondering in what way that further complicates the debate. But I actually was really interested in the example of the fearless girl on Wall Street as a recontextualization without directly affecting the material of the monument. And what I thought was really interesting about that is that was a commissioned piece by an asset management company, I believe, that happened around International Women's Day. And so a lot of people sort of criticized it as being a bit of a publicity stunt, although it's kind of seen universally as like sort of like this big statement of this defiant young girl against like sort of the powers of Wall Street. And it got moved to face Wall Street. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, in what way, like, does the fact that it was commissioned by like an asset management company, and it wasn't really like this Bansky-esque, you know, statement on like capitalism, does that kind of change it as dissent? And also, in what ways sort of like putting it in front of Wall Street kind of almost sort of placating without actually really, you know, it's recontextualization, but without actually addressing underlying issues.
So Kelly, I'm sorry, Natanya?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, well, and I think with the example, I think I certainly wanted to illustrate how while separately those two pieces of work had separate meanings and were not contemporaries of each other, and done by different artists for different reasons, commissioned by different people, but when put together, right, when they were both removed from their context, we as a public took a whole different meaning from it without knowing any of the details. And I think that is certainly the power of symbolism. And even whether it was a publicity stunt or not, it was incredibly effective. And so if we can use that as a framework for thinking about some of our other monuments that are begging to be contextualized, I think that's sort of the point to that.
Right.
As for the taxpayer dollars, so I can only speak for the state government and leaves funding and things, and that the state budget is controlled by the General Assembly, and so this is where voting becomes incredibly important. The General Assembly are the ones who are going to control both the funding of Lee and the VMFA reimagining of Monument Avenue, and a lot of that money, I suspect not all of it, but a lot of that money will be taxpayer dollar, and it will be decided upon by the General Assembly. And so they are the ones who control the state budget, and they're the ones who are going to make those decisions. And so, you know, to help control that conversation, it's about voting and becoming a legislator if you are passionate enough to go into politics. So yeah, I don't know how much that I think it slows things down. I'm not so sure how much it complicates things, but it does slow things down because government takes a lot longer than the bigger that government gets. So I think it's just a matter of, you know, getting the government to do what the government does. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Or sorry, not Kelly. Natanya. Sorry.
Natanya.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Natanya.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm just going to note real quickly, so we have a little less than 10 minutes left. We are going through, there's so many questions, and I know we won't be able to get to all of them. Some of them have already been kind of addressed, so I hope you guys will forgive Jenny and I kind of choosing ones that we think we haven't quite addressed yet, and forgiving us that we can't touch on all the others today. And then I'll hand it to Jenny.
Sorry, I'm just going through these real quick. We have a question from Elizabeth Morse, who asks, what are the panelists' thoughts on the dispensation preservation of all the correspondence, drawings, blueprints, documents, etc. of these monuments, and also that there is more documentation that's produced when monuments come down. She's a paper conservator, so she's curious about how this documentation relates to the preservation of the monuments themselves.
For Lee, a lot of the documentation is already held at Library of Virginia or UVA, I believe. And a lot of that documentation that's being produced currently will also, I suspect, be held at one of those two places, including likely whatever comes out of any time capsule that's found in Lee will also be preserved and likely held at an archive in Virginia. And there's also 3D scans of monuments that are being held at usually educational facilities because they have larger storage for electronic data. And so the idea is that trying to make sure that all that information is still publicly accessible, I think is really the goal. But it is all being preserved at various archives. So, yeah.
Burt or Dell, do you want to add on, or should I move to the next question?
Well, I just say, if the question is, the implication of the question is whether the documentation should go with the statutes, no, because documentation does in fact relate to the history, and we will want to know how these things came about.
Yeah.
And so on, and so that is a completely different issue from the statutes themselves.
I think the bigger question, and it's possible this is what was meant, is the memorial material that's been placed with. I know there's a lot with Lee. I suspect there's some with a lot of other monuments around the country. There's memorial materials that have been placed there besides graffiti. And so that I don't have an answer to, because I know that the George Floyd Memorial has been created with memorial materials that were left. And I know there is concerns about memorial materials that have been left at the Lee Monument once there is a decision about what's going to happen with that. But I do not have an answer for what's going to happen with those materials.
But there is by now a kind of established procedure for that kind of thing. They collect the materials at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. They collect those things at Oklahoma City and at the 9/11 Memorial. So people are, people are aware of the need to archive these materials and have a sense of how it should be done.
Well, I think the concern and the open letter that maybe somebody can make available in the chat is the idea that any of these types of memorials would be hidden away as opposed to made accessible to communities that find it important. And I think that's part of it is who is the right repository for these materials, and how do we make them accessible and not hidden away in some manner that's inappropriate.
I think this kind of ties well into one of the last questions we had. So I think we have time for maybe just a couple more. So this one comes in from Joanna, who asks, it's a long question, but I think it's a nice ending place, or close to ending place for us. So the tandem conversations about history textbooks, specifically how they vary from state to state, especially in conservative or progressive leaning states, and the monuments seem to point to a watershed moment in which our society is asking who we are as a country and how is that reflected in our lived spaces and in the stories we tell about ourselves. It seems to me that there's an under-articulated question about the monuments. How do we cope with what we have done? Are we destined for rehabilitation or restitution? And finally, how do we create opportunities for healing after harm?
Yeah. I wish I had an answer. I just would say that we have no choice but to move forward, because otherwise, what's the alternative?
Yeah, I don't think anyone has a 100% answer to that.
No, I think I would go back to what Katherine said earlier about, it's a continuing struggle. Textbooks are controlled by states, big states, that is, textbooks are chosen by states. Big states that buy a lot of textbooks, such as Texas, have a lot to say about what goes in, and there's not a simple answer to it. It's just bit by bit, case by case. You have to keep pushing.
I think if the answer was simple, we would have sorted this out by now.
Yes. Yes.
Exactly. But I have faith.
Yeah.
I think that, ties pretty well into our last question, since we only have about a minute left. All of you have done, quite a lot on this topic in different regards, working to remove hate symbols, educating others, etc. How do you stay motivated in what you do amidst everything that has been discussed and is going on?
It's hard. It's hard to stay motivated. Personally, I really like being an educator, so that helps. And I think this is a great topic to help people understand. I also have a therapist, and that helps. I mean, in all honesty, I think it's hard to take on. And recognizing you're not the only person, that this is a group effort. So sometimes you can take a break. Let somebody else do it.
So yeah, it just involves a cocktail hour for me every Friday and Saturday, and then Sunday start to gear up, and Monday I'm ready to go.
I like Burt's plan.
Dell, did you want to add something?
Oh, like most of what I do, we kind of fall into it by accident. I thought when I finished the civil rights book, I was done with monuments, but then into the Confederate monument stuff, and then I guess what keeps me motivated is discovering new aspects to the situation. What I said at the beginning about truism, I don't want to keep saying over and over again Confederate monuments or white supremacist monuments. I want to think about other kinds of monuments in ways that they may enlighten us about the way we think about problematic monuments like those of the Confederacy.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we're going to wrap up there. I know we're probably like a couple minutes over. It's been wonderful to have all of your contributions to this conversation. I really enjoyed it. I think from the chat, it's we're getting a lot of comments in here of people that have said this has been really eye-opening for them. And we hope it's been a good discussion for all of you. I think with the webinar version, it's really hard for us to like all clap together, but
allow us to clap for everyone.
Allow us to clap for you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experiences and insights with us.